Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today for what is actually our last webinar in our grains industry webinar series. My name is Cassandra Malice, and I am a program manager at Craft. And I am just so excited to introduce to you all Erika and Christina. But first, I just wanted to let everyone know in the audience that we are recording today's session. So you will be able to go back and view it if you missed it today or if you want to reference it later. Additionally, we have recorded all of our previous sessions from this series as well. And so I'm going to put in the chat a link to our YouTube where all of you can view those previous webinars that we had this summer. We can use the Q&A function or the chat function to ask questions to Erika and Christina. So please feel free to drop any questions or comments there. And lastly, at Craft this summer, we have just launched what we're calling the Commonwealth Grains Community, which is a community of grains professionals, a free kind of place online on the Craft website for people to learn about networking events, educational opportunities such as this, meet each other across industries, and a place for people to connect. So I will drop a link to that community in the chat as well if you're interested in joining. And without further ado, I will pass it over to Christina and Erika. Thank you so much.
Hi, my name is Christina, and I am a graduate student at Chatham University who's actually finishing her master's with a focus in local grains in southwestern Pennsylvania. And I'm here to moderate and help with the conversation with Erika today. So if you have any questions, I'll be checking the chat box. But yes, I'm originally from Houston, Texas, and have a background in bakery science and using local grains within Peace Corps in sub-Saharan Africa. Oh, make sure you're not muted.
Yeah, sorry about that. Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Erika Bruce. I am affiliated with Craft. I have the pleasure of doing what's called a Maker in Residence with them. Over the past year was a semester-long program, unfortunately during COVID, but where I was able to develop my business, which is called Beau, Gateau, and it's sort of a European style. I guess right now it's still an online bake shop. I don't have a storefront yet, but it was a wonderful opportunity. And through that program, I was able to start testing using local grains and working them into recipes that I had already developed, over my years of being a pastry chef and working in restaurants and working in bakeries. And I previously had my business as a wedding cake business. So it was a really great opportunity to start exploring that. And I've learned a lot in the process. So hopefully I can pass some of that knowledge on to you guys. Before I was running my business, I have worked, like I said, previously in bakeries and restaurants, and for many, many years at Cooks Illustrated magazine, which is really where I got most of my recipe development experience, which is obviously geared more towards the home cook, but doing that sort of experiential style testing has been really helpful when you're starting to introduce sort of newer products. So yeah, we are here to talk about that. I don't know, Christina, do you want to start with some questions, or do you want me to just sort of keep rambling on?
I think we can just kind of pop into it and just like start talking about maybe like, how you started working with local grains and like what even really brought you to that in Pittsburgh, and kind of go from there.
Yeah, so I moved to Pittsburgh about a little over 10 years ago for my husband's work. So previously I was mostly in Boston and some part in San Francisco. I've been working at home mostly just developing recipes from home using supermarket ingredients, because that's what we had to do when developing recipes for home cooks, right? We had to kind of test with ingredients that were accessible to everyone. But when I restarted my business, I knew that I wanted to be more sustainable, number one, and I wanted to definitely work with more local ingredients, whenever possible. And I mean, definitely that's what brought me to Chatham and to craft. So doing that, and again, like, you know, I have worked with whole grain flours too, which is like another component of this. Like we're talking local grains and we're talking whole grains, right? I've used them in a more traditional sense, like, you know, you're making a loaf of rye bread, so you use rye flour. But and now, and it's certainly not a new thing. I think now it's, which is I think a great thing. It's definitely, I don't want to say trendy, but it's definitely trending. People are starting to bake more sweets with whole grains. So that's certainly my angle right now. I am, you know, I put rye flour in my chocolate cake. You know, it's a chocolate chiffon cake, but I'm still putting rye flour into it. And I'm using, you know, whole wheat pastry flour and as many things as I can. And I'm totally in love with spelt flour. So I'm introducing that into like my biscuit recipe, things like that, you know, buckwheat into cookies. And so, yeah, I've done a lot of that experimenting where I take my existing recipes and I introduce these like newer flours. So, yeah.
So would you say, Erica, that like, yeah, these recipes that you had, they didn't really recommend rye flour or spelt flour, but you're like, you know, what if I start throwing it in there? Like, I guess at what like percentage maybe did you start incorporating those flours into your recipes? Is it just like, you know, like, I don't know if you want to say like a percentage, or you could say even just like a quarter cup or something, or how did you kind of start experimenting?
That's a really great question. And I do find that certainly when you're, especially when you're dealing with, you know, like sweets and like cakes and more tender baked goods, even with breads though, really, I usually start with, yeah, some sort of percentage. Like it wouldn't be like a 1-to-1 full swap for the flours. And it does take some experimenting. I mean, I guess I usually try to start on the higher end. And, you know, I try to add as much as I can get away with without compromising the structure and the texture. But I mean, I would say that generally I mean, a couple times I've been able to get away with like 50-50. Like I would say with, I'm trying to think, my biscuits. Sorry, I'm in a sunny spot. I'm gonna move over a little bit. I was able to get away with like a 50-50 spelt all-purpose flour ratio, but something like that chocolate cake, that chocolate chiffon cake, it was a much lower percentage, and I can't think of it off the top of my head, but I want to say it's like maybe 25 or even less, 20% is the rye flour, which I sift to get rid of any of the. Sometimes you can find like a really finely milled rye flour, which you don't need to do that. But the local ones that are available that I like, I give it a little sift to get rid of any of that bran that I can feel in a sponge cake kind of situation. You probably wouldn't feel it. I don't feel it, actually. I don't sift it when I use it in my chocolate chip cookies because you're dealing with a much denser, chewier texture. And that's actually kind of a nice thing to have in there. So yeah, I mean, I guess I try to get away with as much as I can, and I work back if there are structural deficits or even texture that's something that you could like mouthfeel.
Yeah, and I would say like, yeah, when you're doing that too, like have you, when you're working with these local and regional flours, are you finding differences or difficulties with using it in terms of like sometimes, you know, a rye flour might have a different percentage of protein than an all-purpose flour, and so like how are you able to like alter that? Like would you say that you kind of learn that through Cooks Illustrated or just your own experimentation? Because I think a lot of what I've learned in my thesis and what people have told me around here, and even you and I have had experiments with donut recipes, like soft flours are more prevalent in this region, but lots of like just regular bakers who go to culinary school might not know the difference between a hard or a soft wheat. And I guess like when you were just training and learning all the things with pastries, like was there anybody in your time that mentored you and how to use that, or was that your own kind of exploration?
God, that's good. Because when you started talking about that, because I definitely remember learning about that in culinary school, and it was just something you like memorized and you wrote down on paper. And I think that really, I want to say only recently now that I'm starting to experiment, has it started to mean something to me, and how it affects baked goods. Because like I said, I mean, I haven't really experimented this much before. I was kind of using what was available to me, whether it was in the restaurant supply store, like the local restaurant depot, or whatever whatever restaurant I was working at or bakery, what they ordered, that was what it was. I wasn't really in that position where I was making those decisions. And then when I worked at Cook, certainly like we would, I remember doing a pizza dough, and then we said, let's do a whole wheat variation. And so then I would start experimenting with that. But again, we were trying to use the whole wheat flour that was like most widely available, in the supermarkets. We'd had to be really careful that we couldn't choose, even if there was, a brand that we absolutely loved, you might only be able to source it in New England, right? And so we couldn't really call for it, or we'd have to offer another option. I do think that's changing, and I think it's great. I think now when I go to the grocery store, there are brands like Bob's Red Mill and Arrowhead that are like, I'm seeing in all of the local stores, at least in our area, which is, I think, great. I mean, it's nice that people have other options. They are definitely more expensive, which isn't great, because that means that they're not necessarily accessible to everyone. But, hopefully, with more and more people, using whole grains and using local grains, there'll be more of a, supply and demand situation that might hopefully curb the cost. But I think that, sorry, I totally got away from your question there a little bit. I do think, I really think a lot of it is about your personal choice, your personal preference. I mean, I know what you're saying, like there's different types of flour that, and bread flours are made from different types of wheat. And so flours tend to be more categorized based on their, their function and their purpose. Once you get into the whole grain flours, to me, I think I'm still learning as I go, and learning, which flours behave how. And I haven't even tried all the flours yet that I want to try. Like, just bought some acorn flour, and I'm like really excited to experiment with that. So, and that's what makes it exciting for me, because I mean, I've been baking for, at least 25 years. And then to still be kind of learning and trying new things makes it really exciting. And I also want to try milling my own flour and seeing how the freshness of that affects, the end result. So again, my advice to people who are starting to get into this is like, you are going to have to experiment a little bit. It's always a great place to start with your tried and true recipes. But yeah, all these flours are going to behave differently. They're going to hydrate differently, right? It's going to affect how much water or moisture you're adding to your recipe. It's going to affect the structure of whatever you're baking, the color, the flavor, all that kind of stuff.
Could you speak more to like the hydration? Because I know, like, I personally, like, when I was baking with some flour that I got from this mill in Kansas, it was a stone milled flour. It was a hard white, and I thought, oh, like, it's a hard white, like maybe it won't be like super hard to hydrate. And then I realized that like my sourdough recipe did not accompany the hydration that was necessary for it, and it ended up being just this block. And I was like, that's not great, but maybe next time I'll up the hydration.
Yeah, no, for sure. I think I would say, well, okay, first I'm gonna say hydration. Like, I find as a baker, it really depends, like so much affects how much your flour is going to absorb. Really, for me, especially in Pittsburgh, it's super humid and hot in the summer, and my doughs will come out better. So, I always have kind of a range in my recipes, and in the winter, they're always going to need more water, no matter what, no matter where I'm storing them. It's just, I think you kind of get used to those slight discrepancies. I also know that whole grain flours generally will absorb more water. The bran, and the germ will absorb more water, significantly more water. And I read this somewhere for an article I did for Milk Street magazine, and I couldn't find it again, but I want to say it's like at least 3 times more. Like a rye flour will absorb like 3 times more water than say like an all-purpose. And higher protein flours will absorb more water also. Like a bread flour will require more hydration than an all-purpose flour. And also cake flour will, require a lot less. So yeah, I would say the softer flours absorb less. So all that said, some ways I've kind of tried to deal with that, like especially if I'm making a bread that has like a starter or a sponge, I'll try to add as much of the whole grain flour to that part and give it more time to absorb some of that water. And then I find that when I get to the second part of the recipe, there won't be as much fluctuation because that flour has kind of had time to hydrate. And so that's one little trick that I've done. Yeah, I don't know. Again, it comes from experience, right? So you having had experience, you knew something was wrong right away, right?
Yeah, I think it's a lot of feel.
Yeah, so you look at it and you said that's not the way it should look. Unfortunately, I think a lot of home bakers, I know when I the people that I was writing recipes for, it's very, very difficult to write recipes for breads and things like that, even like pie dough, because again, there's this variation in hydration that can fluctuate so much, and it's really hard to teach people. You have to make it over and over and over again until you get a feel for what the correct texture is, and then it's much easier when you're going to approach a recipe. But yeah, that's just, I guess, people don't want to hear that, but I can sometimes say, you just got to practice. It's really hard to, if you haven't never made something, even as an experienced baker, if you've never made something before, you're probably gonna have to make it a couple times before you feel pretty good about it.
So would you say that somebody that is this is hard when it's in a business setting of I've talked to even Chloe from Crustworthy, where she's I would love more hours to spend experimenting, but I have to get a product out to the market now. So it's I can't just have a rye flour that's not going to work with my rye bread. I need it to work because my customers are expecting a consistent product, even though they know that there's going to be some fluctuations because she uses local grains. So I guess how do you kind of go about that in terms of trying to, make time for experimenting, but make time for your business as well. And just kind of that in between for you.
It's hard. Yeah, it's hard. And I can relate to her. And I think you just need to be patient with yourself, because there's so much I want to do. And yeah, you don't have time. There's so many other things especially if you're starting a business and you're wearing all the hats. You definitely feel yourself pulled in different directions. Whereas when I was working, let's say for a magazine and developing a recipe, I was working 1 month on, a whole month on one recipe. So there was this hyper focus. Yeah, and you don't have that luxury when you're working in a professional setting, and you do need to work quickly and make decisions quickly. That said, you have slower times. I guess I would just say take advantage of times when you're not quite as crazy busy, and sort of pick a recipe and then just be I'm gonna play around with this. Or sometimes I'll make a recipe for a while and then I'll get to a point where I'm I'm not happy with this. It's just, I'm not in love with this recipe and I need to fix it. And
yeah.
Just sometimes you just need to devote some time to do that. Sometimes I use an excuse of I'm going somewhere or I need to bring food somewhere. Then I'll experiment.
Yeah.
Experiment with family and friends.
Yeah.
So that way I can at least work it into the rest of my life, and use that time. But yeah, it is challenging. But I think any chef, they'll tell you that you're always trying to work on something else, something new, and trying to add new things. Me, I don't know when I'll be able to start making flour, but it's on my list.
Mm-hmm. Now, do you think when you go to whichever local mill that you're at within Pittsburgh, have you ever had conversations with the miller beforehand, being I don't know, maybe it was the first time that you went and bought flour from Frankfurt or Weatherbury or something, and you said, hi, I make cakes, and is there any knowledge that you can impart on me or recommendations for flour? Have you ever talked to the miller and had a conversation with them?
I haven't, but I absolutely love that idea. And that's one of the things I'm so excited about joining this Commonwealth Grains community, because I have not been able to find a suitable substitute for King Arthur cake flour. Mm-hmm. And there's nothing wrong with King Arthur. I mean, I love King Arthur cake flour, but, and I love it because it's unbleached, but, you know, it's not local for me. And so that's one of my goals through this association, is to try to network. And I think it's really, 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 really important to have that ongoing conversation between, you know, the people developing the grain and the people farming it and the people milling it and people selling it and the people, you know, the bakers who are baking with it. I mean, it's like this whole connected system, which, yeah, I mean, I think it's great to have this opportunity. I really, really think it's important. I haven't had that chance yet. And, you know, I just go about it. I buy small quantities and samples and I play with it that way. And I just sort of, you know, instead of going to, you know, and I'm not, I mean, hopefully my business will get to the point of grow to the point where I can approach people and say, hey, I'm looking for this particular type of flour. I want it to do X, Y, Z in whatever I'm making. You know, what can you recommend? Or maybe you can point me in the direction of somebody, or, you know, let's work on something together. So I think that's really exciting.
Yeah, no, I think there's definitely, like, in my time in just researching and helping craft with, like, the creation of the Commonwealth Grains community, I really found there was a lot of disconnect between, like, the farmer, the miller, and the baker. Like, the farmer, like, would bring the wheat product to the miller, but the miller wouldn't realize that, like they might know the hydration that it was harvested at and stuff like that, but they wouldn't realize that it was, like, a bad year for the protein. Like, so there was maybe, you know, a drought, or there was too much rain, and then they lost some grain, so, like, it wasn't as good of quality. And then the baker gets it and it's just like, why is this so different from last year? It's the same farmer, it's the same mill. And I think that's, like, something that could definitely be improved in that whole chain, which I think is really important for why regional grain networks exist. And I think it was last week, yeah, in Maine, they had the kneading conference. I didn't get to attend it. It was virtual, but it seemed like a really cool opportunity. Anyone who's on here, definitely, if you're not from Pittsburgh, I would definitely try to see if you have a regional grain network in your area, especially on the East Coast. There's plenty on the West Coast as well. Not so much as many in the Midwest, but there's a lot of opportunities for people to connect. And you'd be surprised how much, like, a farmer or a miller wants to talk about their flour or talk about their grains, and help you, because, like, not all bakers are going to know what they're getting themselves into when they start working with a local grain, but the miller or the farmer is going to be like, well, yeah, I've actually tried this before and it didn't turn out well, so, like, this is what you need to do. And I think, so this is a good question too. Like, I mean, even on, like, the King Arthur bags, they do have, like, the protein percentages. And do you, like, find that you see that also on, like, the local grain packages, or do you ask the miller sometimes if they have that information to kind of help you better, like?
Yeah, I mean, that information usually is provided. Yeah, I mean, if it's not, you know, and again, because this has all happened during COVID, I've been ordering online. So sometimes it's a little harder to get that information, but generally, it should be labeled. I mean, it should be something that they're aware of. But again, you know, I'm buying flour for its purpose, right? Flour, like, I buy all-purpose flour, you know, and I'm choosing organic, and I'm choosing something that's local, and that's about, I wouldn't say there's, like, a lot of options within that. It's not like I have this whole list of, like, all-purpose flours with different, you know, qualities. So yeah, I mean, it's something to be aware of, I guess. I'm just excited that I can get, like, pastry flour and, like, whole wheat pastry flour, which I never even knew existed, has been, like, my new favorite thing. So again, I guess I'm paying more attention to the types of flour rather than, like, actual specific percentages. But I'm also extremely small operation, and it's just me. So for people who are operating on a larger scale and producing more, I think that they would definitely want to pay more attention to stuff like that. You know, let's say you have a pizza company and you know, just make gobs and gobs of dough, and it has to be the same every time. And yeah, that would definitely be more of a concern.
So there's little question here or comment from Denise. She's saying, "Hi, I went to a local mill here in South Carolina. One thing that was interesting to me is the miller said that because they use the same flour for different grains, some of the flours can be intermingled, so you will never get a pure flour. Just wondering how to handle that." And I mean, I don't know if you want to start. You can start, and I can follow up on that.
Yeah, no, that's interesting. Yeah, I guess. Okay, so they're saying that there's like still like some of the flours left in the mill.
Yeah.
Grains.
So it's like used for different grains. You know, like sometimes like on a package they'll be like, "This was processed in
Yeah,
a facility with almonds" or something. Yeah.
Yeah, if you're running a gluten-free business, that is definitely something that you want to be aware of. That would be concerning. I think I would be less concerned if there was a little bit of buckwheat in my, I don't know, rye or something like that. I really don't think it would even be noticeable. I assume that the percentage is extremely small, but yeah, if you're dealing with allergies or you're trying to sell yourself as, 100% gluten-free, that would be definitely something to be aware of. And you know, I guess you would be aware of it because you would source your, I mean, I haven't done a lot of gluten-free baking, but you would probably need to be sourcing your ingredients that absolutely said that they weren't processed on equipment that had any interaction with flour. Same like if you're trying to say you're, a nut-free facility, that's, something to be aware of too.
Yeah, that wouldn't work too well. Yeah, I think it's like, I mean, speaking to Denise, I don't think it would be a huge deal if you had like a little bit, like Erica's saying. But yeah, it's like when it comes to allergens and stuff like that, it's definitely really important to know that and talk to your miller. But most mills, yeah, like that's gonna happen because they're using the same rolling stones. But some mills do make sure that if they have a different product that is gluten-free, so maybe it is buckwheat flour, they mill it on a separate mill. But like lots of small mills just don't have the capacity to have a second mill to mill those types of flours. While like the larger mills are going to have these huge operations where they have a whole separate facility dedicated to a gluten-free flour or something like that. But for the most part, I don't think it generally greatly affects your product by any means. So I don't think it would be too much of an issue. But I think a good question from like thinking about those different flours that you're saying you're using. Oh, Denise says, yes, great point. Thank you. Is when you're trying to start incorporating these flours into your business, you have to start thinking about price. And would you say that there's any flours that like might be on the like less expensive side of things that like are easier to incorporate? Like for example, Southwestern Pennsylvania, like we have a lot of buckwheat, and so buckwheat flour, I don't know price wise, I don't have like a cost sheet in front of me, but would you say like that's a cheaper flour to start kind of putting into your product that like would just be like one way that you could kind of add that like we use local grains like in our products or something? Or is there any like recommendations like where to start on the flours that are provided locally just to meet people's accessibility range?
Yeah, that's a great point. I think, and I wish I had the answer too, because I guess I would say I don't use a large enough volume of the whole grain flours to like be as concerned. I think for me, the price concern comes from because I use mostly the the all-purpose and the pastry flour and the cake flour for what I specifically bake. And that is a choice that I just decided that I want to source as much locally and as much organic as I can. And you do have to charge more. You have to absorb that cost somehow. But my hope is that not only is it, I mean, I'm not sure the consumer cares as much as I do about where it's coming from, but I also strongly believe that it's an improvement in flavor and texture, like across the board. And I'm hoping that at least the consumer and the customer, that like they are able to appreciate that. And so far, I mean, I probably should be charging more than I am, and I'm still working on that. And that's again like finding time to sit down there and like sit down and crunch all of the numbers and figure out like, am I charging enough? But and like I said, like I go and I just came back from a trip to San Francisco and I couldn't believe what people were charging. So, if there's a market, people will pay for it. Like especially like it's gluten-free. If you're gluten-free and you find a gluten-free bakery that you love, you're going to pay for it, right? Because the trade-off is worth it.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. So I do think, you have to offset the costs for sure. But again, because I'm not using, and I'm sure like Chloe from Crustworthy, who uses many of her breads, it's 100% whole grains.
Mm-hmm.
I'm sure that's a concern for her as well. Although I will say, I feel like she's extremely fairly priced. Like I'm always kind of shocked at her prices. So she'd probably be a better person to ask.
Check out Crustworthy, Chloe Newman.
Yeah,
you can find her at the Bloomfield Farmers Market and in Lawrenceville as well. But yeah, I think it's like interesting because that your point about flavor. I was reading the book Heritage. I can't remember the chef. Why am I? Is it Sean? I can't remember. He's on Netflix, Chef's Table, and he worked with Anson Mills down in the South, and they work a lot more with like corn and rice and all these other things. But he talked about how the big thing for him was just like the flavor. As a girl from Texas, I really like grits, for example. And he talked about when he makes grits, like some people put a bunch of cream and sugar and butter and all that stuff. And he's like, I love the flavor of these grits so much that I just use water and salt. And like, I can just eat it all day because the flavor is so much more than any grits that you would buy at the store that are just like, 5-minute grits, 10 minutes grits and stuff. And I think that's a big selling point that for a chef is easy to like, you can differentiate, but like for a consumer, sometimes they're like, well, I don't really taste it if it's covered in, blackened shrimp or some other like, right, topping on it. Or even like if you're in a cake, it's like you have this super decadent rich chocolate cake, but you won't maybe taste the flour as much unless it is that like sharp rye that kind of like has that extra thing going for it. But I think it's super hard to decide where to start in your business, I think, with like the flours that you're going to use in your product.
I think that's a good point. But then, to kind of counter that, let's say you are sourcing that, that amazing, the grits. Mm-hmm. So now you don't have to cover it up or embellish, I should say, not cover it up, but like embellish its flavor using butter and cream and all these other ingredients, right? So maybe you're offsetting your cost that way. Me, I don't really like sweets that are extremely sweet. And I feel that far too many bakeries cover up cheaper ingredients with sugar, right?
Yeah.
I mean, they don't even want to use, I'm not trying to throw other bakeries under the bus or anything like that, but I'm just saying, less generally speaking, they're not even using good quality butter or maybe not butter at all. And so then they add all these sugar to kind of make it taste like, be satisfying to the customer. And I would totally, go in the other direction and be like, I want them to taste the flour that's in the cookie or the cake, and say, oh, what's different about this cookie? Why? And experience the flavor on different levels and on a deeper level, right? And if you are going to use a cheap chocolate and you're trying to make a, chocolate chip cookie, try to just, how are you, it's just, I think at some points it really does come through. And I do think that people will notice the difference. Yeah. So
sometimes, I think it's like if you're spotlighting a local grain, you're actually able to be cheaper in terms of like what else is in that product. So, because butter and cream and things like that are super expensive as well. And those are always things to think about as a baker. But it's just like about what ingredients are you going to kind of be like, oh, like we can pick the cheaper one. And I think sometimes people do immediately go to flour because they're like, oh, it's it's just like not a big deal. And my mom even like, we're making brownies a couple weeks ago and she's like, these brownies don't taste the same as the other one. I was like, well, because I think your cocoa is like not good, or like your flour is also expired, and I was like, what are we gonna do? And it's just like sometimes you have to think about like when you look at the recipe, like what is the largest quantity of an ingredient, and flour is such a big part of that.
It's structural, right?
Mhm.
Just the glue that holds everything together. And I mean, it's so much more than that. And it's
Yeah.
something that I do a lot. And we started doing it at Milk Street. We started toasting flours. And
Ooh.
yeah, and that's another way to really heighten the flavor of a specific flour, that even if you're not using that much of the flour in the recipe, I just dry toast it. Usually I use a skillet if it's a small amount of flour, but
Yeah.
thinking about trying it in the oven at the bakery. But it's a great way to bring out the, toast it up, and it kind of, just like you're toasting nuts, right? You're releasing some of the
Mhm.
oils that are in there and the fats, and enhancing the overall flavor. And then it gives it kind of it gives it extra nuttiness.
Yeah, for
So
sure.
something to try, yeah.
When would you say it was that you started using like regional flours at your bakery? Like, was it from the get go when you started it here in Pittsburgh, or
Yeah, I
did
mean,
you?
this is totally my main reason for doing the maker in residence through
It
craft.
was through craft. It was.
Yeah, was to get connected with what was out there, because I had not worked in a professional setting in this
Mhm.
area, so I had really limited access. Again, going
Yeah, to
back
know.
to creating those networks. Yeah, I just didn't. So yeah, I heard of Anson Mills. I heard of, like I said, Erika Mills, like those places, but I didn't know anything that was local. I didn't even know that buckwheat was like a local crop until
Yeah.
I
No,
learned.
it's crazy. Yeah.
So I think it's incredible. Yeah. So for me, it's been like invaluable experience. And right, I'm really only less than a year into it. So like I said, I do have a lot more to learn, but it's so far only been a positive experience. And I think my recipes have certainly gotten better.
Mhm.
Yeah. So
Yeah. What would you say like has been like your biggest difficulty in that
the
use of
cake flour.
the
I
cake flour? Yeah.
making flour, yeah, and I've tried experimenting with pastry flour, even
Mhm.
adding cornstarch, and it's just I make a lot of chiffon cakes and sponge cakes, and
Yeah.
the difference is noticeable. Like I think if I was doing a butter cake, I could get away with it.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I think there's definitely like a really hard time with like when you're using stuff like a sweet. I think for a lot of people who are doing just breads or like scones or cookies or something, like regional flour is like, oh, no big deal. But I think it is when you get into the cakes and the pastries that you're like, this is actually a lot harder, because like what I'm used to is more refined, and doesn't have as much bran of it. But I think that's kind of like where maybe some regional flours could even just expand their business, is like in the terms of like sifting the flours, like you were saying, like even for you, like you sift out some of the bran out of rye or something to make it work. I think that is a way that maybe a local business, like if they're just like, maybe this just isn't really working for me, but it's not necessarily the flour, it's just that there's maybe too many particles of German bran that are kind of making my flour sink and not fluff. And and so sometimes it is,
Purposes is definitely, yeah.
yeah, I think it's almost an extra work step for some bakers, because they're like, that's just like one more thing I have to do and I don't really want to do it. But I think it could be an easy fix. But sometimes maybe that is like where I think having a relationship with your local miller could be an advantage of like, hey, I'm not really satisfied with the products that I'm getting out of your pastry flour. Is there a way that you could sift this one more time? Like just throw, like not even like a huge extra step for them, but could be an extra step for you. Just being like, hey, could you sift this one more time just to see if there's anything else that you can get out, because I'm not getting what I'm wanting out of this.
I think that's a great point.
Yeah.
And again, like going to consistency, like depending on where you live and what your local mill produces, like there's going to be a huge variety in what people get in our area versus in a different part of the country. So again, like having that conversation with your miller and saying like, this is the product I'm expecting, you know, or what are you offering?
That's what I think.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, sure, go ahead. No, I was like, I think it's like a lot of bakers that I've talked to are just like, it is like, we've had this whole conversation right now of just being like the inconsistency that people find within local flours. But I think that's something that with the popularity that it's happened, even especially in the pandemic when flour shelves were gone, like everything was gone, and they're like, where do I go? And like for you, like you should definitely speak to that, because we had this conversation of like, yeah, I guess orders took a little bit longer at the beginning, but like you were still able to get local flour during the pandemic. That's right.
Yeah. And I've definitely talked to some chefs that have had real difficulty sourcing, and I think it might even be worse now than it was in the beginning. It's a huge problem. And I don't know, it's heartbreaking. I mean, the restaurant business is really, really struggling. So, you know, they certainly don't need another challenge and hurdle, but I think definitely, I mean, I think like with anything that you're going to get locally, right, the shorter the supply chain, you know, the less problems you're going to have with, I think that one of the biggest problems is transportation. Right, I mean,
especially right now.
There's problems with workers and stuff like that, but I think that if you can eliminate as much of that distance and travel and all of that shipping, and you know, then you're going to be better off, for sure. And I know I was just, you gave me a flashback to when it was, and I was like, every time I go to any store, if I find any flour, I would buy it. And I had like the weirdest mishmash of like random supermarket flours at home.
I had like almond flour and like Tipo Double Zero flour like on my shelf, and my dad was like, I guess we're gonna make like a chocolate almondine cake and some pizza, like but not cookies. And I think it was definitely an interesting time experimenting with different grains that I hadn't used before, which is cool. But I even worked at a mill in Texas called Barton Springs, and they were like freaking out at the beginning of the pandemic because they never had so many orders in their life, because so many bakers were just like, I can't find flour, please help me. I will literally pay you anything just to get a bag of flour. Like,
I hope that they're still using them. I hope that they...
And that's what I really hope, is that in this pandemic, people have been exposed to those different local grains and want to keep using them. But it's very funny. I could talk forever about the random customer comments we would get, being like, okay, your flour is not working the same way as King Arthur. Like, it must be you. And I'm like, or it could be you. But I think it's always so interesting to see how people first start using flours, but for local flours. But do you have like a favorite grain that out of all the ones here, like in your region, that you like the most?
I don't even know how regional it is. I mean, you probably would know more, but I'm totally in love with spelt flour. Of all the flours I've tried, spelt flour is really unique because it almost, even though it's a whole grain, it, like, to me, in my experience, produces like a lighter, fluffier product. And we just talked a lot about this. I just did a spelt biscuit class, and I was researching it because I didn't really know why. I knew it did it. I just didn't really know why it did it. Apparently, it doesn't absorb as much water, and it has more like gliadin and less of the gluten in the actual gluten so it's really interesting, unique product. And I love what it does for pretty much almost anything I add it to. I love it in my pizza dough and my biscuits, and I'm just starting to use it in more sweet applications. But overall, and I've always loved buckwheat, so I was very happy to hear that was such a prevalent local grain. I just absolutely love the flavor of buckwheat. And the fact that it doesn't have any gluten makes it kind of interesting and a little more challenging to work with, but also it can have a lot of benefits. What about you?
So I think spelt, I think it definitely, in making pizza doughs at Chatham's oven that I love to be at, and no longer, but I miss it so much. I love using spelt too. actually, Cassandra, who's on here, she has a really great chocolate chip spelt cookie recipe. And I think it's on her Instagram, but I can't remember. But I love it too in terms of like, yeah, so I know like from my experience with my undergrad, like gluten has, yeah, the two components are like gliadin and glutenin. And so like spelt being more of like a heritage, like ancient grain, like has less of the strain of gluten that is like for people who are like gluten intolerant. People who are like celiac should just not touch it anyways, but because spelt still has like small traces, of course, of gluten in it, but I think it's like it's more easily digestible for a lot of people. So I think it's definitely a grain that if you're like, ooh, I kind of want to make my way back into wheat, but like not necessarily commercialized wheat, like spelt is a really good place to start. So that's why like I love it as a grain. But yeah, I think it's also interesting because even when I was doing the biscuit recipe, I don't know if I told you this, but we didn't have the like sifted spelt. We had the like whole grain spelt that we were putting in, and then we didn't have just regular whole wheat flour from Frankfurt. We had whole wheat bread flour. So, and some people say like this is definitely a good note that I realized like some people are like, you have to use like for biscuits you need to do white lily soft white flour, and like that's the only flour you can ever use for a biscuit. And I was like, I disagree. I just used a whole wheat bread flour and I got the same volume of my biscuit with that and spelt, and like, using another soft white flour that was from Small Valley to still get the same volume. So I think sometimes it's interesting to kind of go against the status quo of like, I think that people just haven't experimented with a different flour. Sometimes it takes there not being that flour in your pantry to realize that you can use it.
No, you're right. Like it takes, when you're working with this kind of stuff, it definitely takes a lot of experimentation.
Yeah.
But like then you find these happy things that you may not have ever really gone down that road if you hadn't had to. And I've had those biscuits, and I think the one thing that I love is that they had such a crispy, crunchy like edges.
Yeah.
And so much flavor that you're never going to get from a white lily bleached,
No.
flour. So yeah, I think it's totally worth experimenting and playing around with whole grain flours, for all those reasons. And spelt, the stretchiness of it for pizza dough, it's like magical. I've never, because a lot of times
magical.
you don't have the right hydration in your pizza dough, and you're trying to, because I don't like to roll it, I like to stretch it, and it'll just snap back or it'll fight you, and you're like, I'm hungry, I want dinner, and it is just like magical. It just like stretches.
Yeah. How would you say like you like to store your flours? Because I know a lot of people have questions about like how long can I keep a regional flour, because it's like it might go bad earlier on.
They go bad, and it's because they contain so much more of the germ in the bran, but more the germ. So they definitely need to be refrigerated. You need to keep them in an airtight container. I like to transfer all my flours into like plastic tubs with tight fitting lids. I mean, if you're at home, you can just, roll down the bag. Sometimes I put them in like a Ziploc bag. For extra, airtightness. But yeah, because the oils will go rancid, and also they are prone to infestations of, little critters that like to eat that stuff too. So refrigerator for if you're using them. If you're not using them very frequently, I would even put them in the freezer.
Yeah. How long would you say that you keep your flours for? Like 3 months? Well, I mean, you're baking a lot more frequently, so I guess it wouldn't.
At work, I'm going through them. At home, I'm ashamed to say that sometimes I've kept flour too long, and even sometimes I had buckwheat flour. I went to use it, and it was so off.
Yeah.
I put it in the fridge. So, but it had been in there for like 6 months or something.
Yeah.
So I would say like a month maybe in the fridge, and then if you're going to go longer, stick it in the freezer. Yeah, I think because again, these are more expensive flours, and you don't want to waste them, and if you're not using them very often,
no, for sure. I think I've kept some local grains just on my shelf, but like in the little OXO containers for a month, and they've been fine. But I've definitely like left a bag of flour at my dad's house like from Christmas break to Christmas break. And I opened that flower and it was like kind of like a block almost, and it was really crumbly, and I was like, oh, I just wasted this. But yeah, so I think that's like basically, we've kind of gone through most of the questions. Do we have any more questions from the audience that we can address? We've really got anything you guys want to talk about? Any difficulties that you guys have seen in your flowers? Trying to see if there's any other questions that I've kind of put over.
Yeah, the only other thing I wanted to touch on that I kind of thought we did, well, we did a little bit, but just in terms
accessibility.
Of, yeah, accessibility, and again, I think that this like opening that conversation, like you said, and the connections between the people using the flower and the people who are involved in the producing of the flowers is really, really important. And if there are people out there, if you professionally, your job is to like provide recipes to people, you have to make them accessible. So that is a challenge in of itself. But as like moving forward, as we do, I think as flowers local flowers become more and more accessible and hopefully less costly, there'll be something that kind of people will be more used to using at home.
Mm-hmm.
It's definitely something to keep in mind. I would love to see, like we go to farmers markets. I'm like, why don't we see flower at farmers markets? Like, to me, that's a perfect opportunity to start that conversation with people, and they can be asking those questions to the millers who are selling. So I'd like to see us move in that direction, but it's certainly worth keeping in mind because it's an issue. It's an issue. Not everybody can afford it. And, I think that's something important to keep in mind is like,
No, I definitely think, like you had sent me an article from the blog Word Loaf about that, and just like finding flowers that work with your budget. Like, I think that's a big thing also to take away from this. Like, we're not saying like you have to use local grains right away, 100% every single product. Like, that's not always the case for some people who are just trying to get off your feet. Like, sometimes with any business, you're not going to make profit that first year or for a few years, like, or 5, 10, who knows, but like you're just breaking even. And so sometimes like the better way to start incorporating flowers is like after you've kind of had, enough profit to invest in those local flowers. But sometimes that's maybe easier if you start your business just using the local flowers, so you can already take that into account. So you're not like surprising your customers when your bread goes from $3.50 to $6.50 a loaf or something. And so
starting with smaller percentages and sort of
starting out with just a little bit and kind of incorporating it, because even like if it's just a small percentage, you're still helping a local baker and a local farmer, which is ultimately helping the local economy, which is always great. So
exactly. Like if we can just kind of continue that loop.
And then hopefully like there's better things that can come for those millers and farmers, and maybe offer the prices at a more accessible thing. So Cassandra's just put also a survey in the chat. If you guys who are on here could fill out, just to kind of get us to understand like ways that we can help the community to improve like education and workshops. A lot of what Craft's been doing is like Erika and I've done in the past is workshops virtually, and hopefully like a little bit of in-person workshops. But it's been great to work out those, because sometimes people's first time using a local product.
And my advice to everybody is find your local, like Christina said, find your local miller and start the conversation.
Yeah, definitely.
Thank you both so much for this amazing conversation. It was so much fun to listen to both of you who are so experienced with grains and baking, and Erika running a business. It was just like so great to listen to you two talk about this today. I will say the Spelt cookie recipe, I think it's in our Eden Hall community cookbook, but I was trying to find it online and I'm not sure where it is. So We'll have to find it, but I've
Stay
also,
tuned.
yeah, stay tuned. But I will say that I love that recipe because I've used any whole grain that I have that I'm like trying to get rid of because it's about to go bad or something. So I've used rye, I've used whole wheat, I've used spelt, just like anything that I have works really well. And I think it's just because there's a ton of butter in it.
You can't go wrong with butter.
Can't go wrong. But thank you both so much. We really appreciate you being here today. And hopefully we will do a webinar series like this again in the future.
Yeah, but definitely check out community or Commonwealth Grains community, and maybe we'll get the recipe book up there someday so you guys can see more recipes with local grains from us.
Awesome. Thank you all for attending, and we will see you soon. Thanks.
Bye.
Bye.